Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today and welcome. My name is Tarek. I'm Shabaka's US Policy Fellow, and I'm also the host of our Policy Lab series. So we're going to get started today as it looks like the audience is filing in, but people can continue coming in as they see fit. So today we're going to be, as we all know, we're going to be discussing the humanitarian situation in Gaza amid this ongoing genocide. And as we all know, when Israel broke the ceasefire in Gaza in March by resuming its bombing campaign at full force, it also launched a total blockade on humanitarian aid. And since then, the Israelis have used their total control of Gaza to obstruct and destroy the pre-existing avenues for aid provision and have replaced them with their own scheme, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, otherwise known as GHF. As of today, Israeli forces have killed over 1,300 Palestinians at these GHF aid sites, and starvation in Gaza has reached new heights. Most of us by now have seen the pretty grotesque images of starving children, yet Israel and its supporters have really embarked on an unprecedented disinformation and propaganda campaign over the last several weeks in an effort to sow confusion about what's happening and ultimately avoid accountability. So today we're going to aim to paint a clearer picture of what's happening in Gaza. And for this, I'm joined by Yara Asi and Alexandra Fagans to discuss the GHF, how it fits into Israel's wider genocidal strategy, and who exactly is profiting from it. So Yara is an Al-Shabaka member and an assistant professor at the University of Central Florida's School of Global Health Management and Informatics. She serves as co-director of the Palestine Program for Health and Human Rights and is also a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. and Dawn MENA. Alex Fagans is a researcher at the Adala Justice Project, currently investigating the GHF's finance structure, which is what she'll talk about today, and the private interests behind the initiative. She recently received her master's degree in public administration and international affairs from Columbia, where she also served as president of the Palestine Working Group. So before we get into it, just a quick reminder about the format. I'm going to be posing questions to Alex and Yara for the first 45, 50 minutes. And then we usually try to save about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to get to questions from you, the audience. So please feel free to submit questions by clicking the Ask a Question button, which should be on the bottom right of your screen. And remember, you can also vote on questions that you find most important. And then we'll do our best to get to as many of the questions as we can with the time we have, and we have about an hour. So let's get started. Yara, I'm gonna start with you. As we all know, that the GHF didn't pop up out of nowhere. It's the result or the culmination of a very long process in which Israel has, over the past year and a half, systematically dismantled and destroyed pre-existing aid networks in Gaza with the objective of leaving no other viable alternative to Israeli-controlled mechanisms of aid provision. So can you kind of walk us through this process and how it's spanned over the last year and a half, and pretty much describe what we're seeing on the ground at the GHF sites today?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tarek and Alex, and to Al-Shabaka for hosting this important conversation at this really painful time, I think. So really, if we wanted to look at the roots of the GHF, we would have to start far beyond a year and a half ago. As everyone, I think, probably on this call knows, Gaza has been under some level of siege consistently since 2007. And so in that period, there was already a process of creating demand among the people of Gaza for humanitarian aid. As we know, Gaza is extremely dense. There's very little land for agriculture. Israel does not allow robust fishing efforts. They don't permit the fishermen to go beyond a certain distance from the shore. Lots of import restrictions on seeds and fertilizers and other things. So Gaza, long before October 7th, was at a significant deficit of the ability for them to produce their own food. And in previous wars, Israel had bombed food factories, bombed livestock, etc., but also had a very already integrated system of humanitarian aid to fill in some of the gaps based on the Israeli siege. So we're already high food insecurity long before October 7th. We're already at a deficit. Starting October 7th and throughout October 2023, we all heard what the Israeli government themselves said that their goal was: complete siege, human animals. I don't think I have to go through all that. And as early as December of 2023, so just about 2 or 3 months in, humanitarian agencies were warning that Israel was using starvation as a weapon of war, that their manipulation of aid imports, specifically food, water, fuel for generators, medical supplies, etc., had no reasonable or legal security or war-related justification, and was in reality a form of collective punishment to pressure the people of Gaza to force displacement, and other goals that had nothing to do with their stated goals. So for almost 18 months, we have been hearing warnings of famine. So the IPC, which is the global famine watchdog, had been warning starting spring of 2024 that there was impending famine if current trajectories continued, in terms of limiting aid, in terms of continuing to force displacement, destroying markets, and everything that they've been doing. So this has not been something that happened overnight, as it's kind of been portrayed in the news, that, oh, we woke up and there's this famine. This has been existing. So in March, towards the tail end of the second ceasefire, Israel decides it's going to put a complete and total siege, nothing coming in at all. And indeed, if you look at the truckloads for those few months, no aid came in. The inevitable happened. People started to starve, and that became very public. But Israel has long had this narrative that the problem with the previous aid system, although we might see the problem as that it wasn't feeding enough people, Israel's contention with the UN kind of distributed aid system was that they claimed that Hamas was stealing the aid. Now, since then, there have been multiple investigative reports that showed not only is there no evidence for this, but leaders in the IDF and Israeli politicians themselves admitted that they internally don't have evidence that this is the case. So the entire premise for the GHF itself is faulty. But what started to happen, and remember, by this point, March 2025, UNRWA has been almost completely defunded, dismantled, discredited. And the UNRWA, part of the larger UN system, had over 400 aid distribution sites throughout Gaza, north, central, and south. The GHF Israel has essentially shut down this system. And now we know that with its partners in the United States, supported or essentially implemented this alternate Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The name itself is almost hard to say. And that this premise was that there would be private military contractors from the United States overseeing, now instead of 400 aid distribution sites, 4 total aid distribution sites for almost 2 million hungry, starving people. And what has happened in the meantime has been absolutely horrific. So aside from the fact that people are starving, the GHF is not delivering enough food to people, we're hearing that, and we're seeing video and seeing significant evidence that this is a lethal system. And every day, nearly, since the GHF has started full operations, there has been reports of dozens of Palestinians killed at these sites. Now, why is this happening? How is this happening? A couple of reasons. The GHF is completely opaque. They put most of their instructions for when people are allowed to visit the sites and where they're allowed to go online. People are usually, and sometimes a few minutes before a site will open. Now, we have to remember all of Gaza is displaced. Some of them are sheltering very, very far from these sites. So they have to travel these very long distances, starving, with incomplete information about what to do, where to go, what's safe. And they show up to these sites. And what we're hearing, and what IDF soldiers themselves have confirmed, is that they're being shot at. The soldiers, the IDF, is being told that they are permitted to shoot at the Palestinians at these sites. And it's become almost daily news at this point that several dozen Palestinians will be killed. We've heard multiple testimonies from people. My father left to go get aid and never came back. Or those who are successful and are able to go get aid have to wait in these incredibly inhumane, just if people have seen the images, very, very, very packed in crowds surrounded by barbed wire fence. I mean, you wouldn't even imagine treating animals this way to get food. Um, and sometimes people are able to leave with a bag of flour or a bag of tinned foods, canned vegetables, or canned meats. In some cases, we've seen people receiving food that is clearly spoiled or old or otherwise insufficient to actually be eating. So, on top of the death count at these sites, people are not getting enough food, and the food they're getting is not suitable really for life. So, we now have this situation where the only aid or actor allowed to distribute aid in Gaza is this Israeli supported GHF effort. It's killing Palestinians. Palestinians are still starving. As of July 25th, we have an official call or an official reporting of famine by the IPC. So we're no longer at threat of famine, precipice of famine. We are in famine conditions right now. And we are not seeing any change in what the GHF is doing. We heard some indication that Netanyahu was being pressured by allies to allow a minimal, quote unquote, amount of aid in. To my knowledge, I haven't really seen any evidence that that's happening. But at this point, we are far past, let's just up the aid and everything will be fine. People need specialized nutritional foods at this point. Children suffering from severe malnutrition, pregnant women, people with disabilities, elderly folks, children, people with pre-existing conditions of all types, and just regular people. They need sustained, not just calories, but nutrient dense food with that may target specific deficiencies that they're having, vitamin deficiencies, minerals, electrolytes, etc. So from top to bottom, this has been an utter failure in terms of providing food to starving people. But if you step back and see that not as its primary goal, as I think we'll talk about later in this discussion, it's probably working exactly as its implementers intended.
Thanks, Yoda. I mean, I think, yeah. I mean, as you say, I think exactly as its implementers intended. It seems clear that it's a means of control, and it's being used as such. Um, Alex, I wanna jump to you just because you've been investigating the very, very extensive network of private sector individuals, companies, and organizations who have been supporting the GHF or making money off of it. Could you tell us a little bit about your research, what you found, and kind of just like paint that picture of the really extensive web of involvement when it comes to both individuals and organizations and private companies, and how they might actually be also benefiting from this financially?
Sure. I mean, basically, what I found through my research is the web behind GHF is incredibly intertwined and interconnected. It was first born kind of and described as an Israeli brainchild, whose foundation was built at the end of 2023 at private meetings at something that came to be called the Mikveh Yisrael Forum. Um, and it was kind of a gathering of military officers, Israeli military officers, and business people with ties to the Israeli government. And GHF has become, kind of a financier to what this plan became. And within this, currently there are some central players, as we know, around which these networks operate. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is one, Safe Reach Solutions and UG Solutions, two of the main security contractors operating under GHF are another. Philip Riley, the founder and CEO of SRS, is another. He's a former CIA operative and has ties to multiple defense contractors and intelligence firms in the US. And when we look into each of these players, we can see connections that span a wide range of sectors, from consulting firms to private equity firms to charities and NGOs to religious operations and leaders like Dr. Reverend Johnny Moore, the executive chairman of GHF, to Israeli and American business people and politicians, and then, of course, a plethora of other defense contractors. And I think that this wide these wide-spanning relationships pretty clearly show the various financial, political, and religious investments involved in this project, which at the end of the day is designed to further Israel's genocide, exacerbate this Israeli and American-made famine, and ethnically cleanse Palestinians from their land. To answer your questions on financial gains, they're pretty difficult to pinpoint because this information is so protected and there's so much secrecy around these companies. A lot of them are registered in Delaware or Wyoming, which where tax privacy laws are pretty strict. And these types of companies, largely private security companies and intelligence firms, are already pretty selective about the information they provide publicly. So with a high profile project like the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, they're pretty protective of what they allow to get out. There is a very specific narrative that they've been pushing in order to get this project off the ground and get funding and to prolong the existence of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and this distribution plan. Yara spoke on it earlier. Part of it is that the crossings are open for aid and the UN is refusing to coordinate with the GHF to bring it in and distribute it. These military contractors are necessary in order to ensure none of this aid is distributed to members of Hamas. And as Yara spoke about earlier, these talking points are not based in reality and are merely used to delegitimize the UN and organizations that have been present and active in Gaza for decades. And while I don't yet know the exact flow or amount of cash, through my work, it's become pretty apparent that it's quite a bit of money involved in this project. There are private equity firms such as McNally Capital, which have a stated interest in certain aspects of this project, namely SRS, and they're pretty well known for also investing in other defense contracting companies and intelligence firms. There are Israeli businessmen who helped create what has become SRS and who have many connections to Philip Riley, connections to Kogat, connections to Unit 8200. And while many financial connections aren't explicit, there is a lot that can be inferred from these connections. And I think at the end of the day, what we have to remember is that this is being run by private companies whose sole focus is to make money. This is no longer a humanitarian operation, but a private endeavor, much like private detention facilities and prisons in the US. Helping people is not the priority for these companies because that is not the purpose of a private business. And their work in Gaza reflects this alongside, the genocidal and colonialist motivations, which also mirrors the foundation upon which Israel was built.
Thanks, Alex. I mean, it's clear that it's like just a huge web of private interests, and I think that's also just how deep that network is. I think is kind of also reflected in Israel's very desperate attempt to push out disinformation and propaganda around that we've seen over the past couple of weeks to ultimately avoid accountability and basically tell us to not believe our lying eyes, right? And I think I hate to give it more oxygen, but I think it is important to spend some time discussing Israel's disinformation strategy around this. And Yada, if I could go back to you, I mean, we've seen they've taken up billboards in Times Square. They've taken out ads on Instagram and Twitter. Can you kind of break down for us why Israel is so desperate to hide this reality of starvation in Gaza, and kind of what type of information warfare tactics they're using in this campaign?
Definitely. So just like the starvation and siege in Gaza, this disinformation campaign has very, very long roots that flow past decades of misinformation provided about Palestinians by Israel and its allies. I think there's a couple reasons for this. First, I think, in terms of hunger, I won't say impossible. It's incredibly difficult to argue when you see pictures of starving people that there is not an outside force that is causing a sudden famine in a population. So we heard in a couple of months ago that Netanyahu has said even his most staunch allies, basically that could withstand any criticism about bombing, raiding, the pre-existing siege, even the reports of torture, kidnapping, basically every horrific thing we've seen over the past almost 2 years was acceptable, that there was a justification people could offer for that. When it comes to starvation, however, even Netanyahu said his allies said, I can't basically see pictures of starving children on the news. You have to figure this out. So rather than really deal with that reality, and dismantle the GHF, open land crossings, basically everything that every humanitarian agency has said needs to be done at this point, has been saying needs to be done at many points throughout this. The alternate route is to just claim that none of this is true. And Israel has been very successful in this strategy in other areas. Now, it's important to remember that this is not our framework for framing of this. Israel itself just last year said it's going to put an additional $150 million into its Hasbara campaigns, which is how it refers to its quote unquote public diplomacy. But this takes the form of, as you said, Tariq, billboards, bots on social media, all to sway or at least plant seeds of doubt into audiences that what you're seeing is either not real. So we've all heard the claims of the Pallywood, right? That these are all staged photos. These aren't real children. Or if they are starving children, they're starving for some other reason. Or look at their parents and why aren't their parents hungry? And, we've seen these fake videos of people creating fake videos, not as if there wasn't enough footage of devastation from Gaza that they would have to create more. So we have seen the seeds of doubt being planted all throughout this. They have been telling us consistently, not just Israel, but its allies, including under previous US President Joe Biden, that things aren't as bad as you think, that the Palestinians are exaggerating, that they're trying to use their suffering to pressure Israel. In fact, it's the inverse of what's actually happening. I think I saw an article in the Atlantic just last week called something like Hamas wants Gaza to starve. So even when the Palestinians are starving to death, this is all part of some Palestinian ploy, right? Don't ask too many questions. Just accept the premise. Because famine in 2025 in the modern age is not natural. Okay, we're not talking some climate disaster where all the crops died, or some pest issue. No, this is humans withholding food from other people. How do you justify that? How do you even, for the most dedicated allies, say, well, starving children, something is about Hamas? Even the argument begins to fall apart very, very quickly. So we're seeing an increased push to discredit Palestinians. And oftentimes it's not even just to call them liars, but just to make people, as you said, Tariq, doubt what they're seeing. You can't control what people see on social media these days. So you have to provide them an explanation for it. And if there's enough people in the audience to take these explanations willingly, because there is a culture of anti-Palestinian racism, that Palestinians are biased, are untrustworthy of portraying their own lived experience, that are inherently violent, and so any violence upon them is justified, that for some reason Israel uniquely does not have to adhere to the laws of war. They both argue that they don't believe in the UN, the Geneva Conventions, etc., but also that they're not doing war crimes anyway, so it doesn't matter. So it's been the problem is not so much that Israel continues to do this. As I've said, we've seen this in the past with many different events, but it's that there is an audience open to buying this. And unfortunately, that audience does not just include trolls on social media, but seemingly heads of state and people with real power to actually intervene and save Palestinian life. Whether they believe it or not, they are accepting that there is something to question. And that in itself is incredibly damaging when you're talking about emergency intervention for a population like this. So Israel doesn't even have to convince, it just has to sow doubt. And it's been able to do that very successfully.
Yeah, if I could stick with you on this, we've all seen, most of us have seen the images of the starvation, but could you actually describe the health and the human impact that Gaza is experiencing right now of the blockade and the starvation tactics? I mean, you mentioned earlier how we've gone from over 400 aid distribution sites operated by independent organizations like the UN and other humanitarian aid organizations that were able to distribute this aid on a daily basis, right? And now we're at four or three that are usually, because since one is often not operational. Yeah, could you just describe and kind of cut through the disinformation and explain to us what impact this has had on the human body in Gaza?
Certainly, even before the March siege, the situation was incredibly dire. So even with the UN system, even with the greater distribution sites, even with some crossings open, some trucks getting in, there has not been a single day since October 7th that enough aid has gotten into Gaza. And we're kind of focusing in on food here, but I mean, I'm talking aid broadly: food, water, fuel, medicine, everything like that. And so people have been hungry for a very long time. But what we are seeing now is a step beyond that. We are seeing many, many households that go more than 3 days without eating. We see food prices in the markets where markets have food are 10, 20, 30 times more expensive for staples like flour, sugar, olive oil, etc. So people are not only don't have enough food to eat, they can't afford the food that exists. The process of starvation is a long process because especially when you're getting intermittent amounts of food. It's one thing if you just stop getting food completely. But for many in Gaza, they were able to get some bread, or we saw reports of people eating leaves or birds' food or animal food. And now we're to the point where for many people, even those minimal options don't exist. So what happens in a situation of starvation, as we're seeing this time, is that the most vulnerable are impacted first. The most vulnerable meaning children, young children, because children have less fat stores, and their children are basically constantly growing, right? So any period without adequate food is really, really detrimental to children. They're not just hungry, but they're missing important milestones of growth and development, vitamins needed for their bones to grow, for their muscles to grow. So we're seeing children starve first, and that's typically what we see in these types of settings. But we are seeing starvation in adults, especially the elderly and adults with pre-existing medical conditions. And part of why they are so much more susceptible to suffering and to starvation is because their medical conditions have been untreated. So when Israel tries to use this as some kind of, oh, well, these children, like the big New York Times story, have a pre-existing medical condition. And it's like, yes, and they were also denied medical treatment as well. So the fact that they're starving after that is not saying that the aid system is working but for this one child. It's just that the aid system is broken completely. So what we will start to see soon, if we see these conditions, is we've already seen, I think, an estimated about 200 deaths from malnutrition and hunger, many of whom are children. It's likely that that number is much higher because just like with bombing, it's people are probably dying in their homes, being unreported. We've heard reports of people collapsing in the streets on the way to hospitals. So that number is probably much higher. But for those who have still survived, we're seeing incredible body weakness, so literally unable to stand. I've seen testimonies from people in Gaza that they're unable to read, unable to think because they are so hungry. Their mind is consumed with thoughts of food, thoughts of trying to get nourishment in some way. we'll start to see organ failure, heart attacks, and other. So a lot of deaths from starvation are due to organ failure. And we will start to see an increasing number of those in the coming weeks, as everyone has predicted. The short-term medical impacts are much more dangerous for children. So some of the children starving today will have stunted growth that will never be reversed, so this is a permanent change to that child's life. And long term, we see increased risk of mental ailments, behavioral changes, and poor immune systems. So a cold that you or I could easily manage and get over, if you're starving, even the most basic cold, or you get a cut and a small infection, your body is unable to fight. People will die from that as well. When we talk about physical impacts, I think that's very clear to people, but I want to bring in the point of psychological impacts. And I've heard, and likely some of your audience has heard Alex Duvall speak on this. And in previous settings of famine, some of the survivors claim that some of the most painful mental scars come from the psychological toll of what it took to survive. So imagine you have a little bit of food and you have 5 children. That decision of which child do I feed? Who do I feed when? Do I feed myself so I have inner energy? A neighbor comes to your house with a starving baby and they're desperate for food. And maybe you have some. Do you give it to that neighbor or do you keep it for your own family? These kinds of decisions are happening daily, daily, daily. And that psychological damage will lead to long-term post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression. We know that. We've seen that. So that's already going to happen. In terms of the broader health impact and humanitarian impact, what we know from previous famines is that there tends to be a tipping point. You'll see a slow amount of death, and then suddenly you will start to see everyone who held on for some period, we will start to see more death in those populations as well. So we predict that in the coming weeks, not only will the death toll increase, but we will start to see more of these reports of secondary characteristics. So peeling skin, people losing hair, children so weak that they can't cry. Much of how this looks in the long term is dependent on when this ends. I was hoping that last week, with the global outcry, there would be a significant push to flood Gaza with aid, get therapeutic foods in there. That has not happened. So as long as the condemnations are not met with action, we are only going to see not just an increase, but an exponential increase, because that is how these things work. And we know that. So any inability to intervene now is complicity in any starvation-related deaths or injuries that are to come.
I'm glad that you mentioned complicity, because again, and here I want to turn back to Alex on this. We've seen, we saw a lot of coverage, for example, about the Boston Consulting Group's involvement in the GHF. But there has been a huge amount of public response to the images that we're seeing out of Gaza. And Yara, as you mentioned, a lot of the health effects are unseen, right? That you can't report on them yet, and it's going to take weeks, if not months, for them to start showing up before it hits like a tidal wave. But and so we have seen this public opposition to what Israel is doing in Gaza, yet we continue to see such deep complicity at the institutional level, right? So Alex, could you tell us about how this level of complicity kind of expands, not just to include security consulting firms and the BCGs of this world, but also universities, university professors, despite all the public opposition to this, despite the student movement that has been rallying against this genocide for months now. Could you just paint a picture of what that web of complicity looks like at these different industries and different levels?
Sure. I mean, as someone who just graduated from Columbia and was involved in student organizing on campus, I don't really need to make connections to GHF to know that these universities are deeply complicit. But there are direct connections. Jennifer Counter, who left Orbis Operations in January 2025 to join SRS as a subject matter expert, is a course associate at Columbia University and at the School of Professional Studies. And, she is not the only example like this throughout this larger security apparatus that we're discussing. At SIPA, the school that I graduated from, the dean, Karen Yarhi Milo, is a former Israeli intelligence officer. And I can say from experience that her bias is clear in how different students and organizations are treated based on their views on Palestine. This past year at SIPA, Mike Pompeo was brought on as a fellow at the Institute of Global Policy. Jacob Liu, former US ambassador to Israel, joined SIPA faculty as a professor as well. Rebecca Wiener, Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism for the NYPD, is an adjunct professor at SIPA. And not only was she involved with the NYPD's violent response to the encampments in Hinds Hall, but her bureau has an office in Tel Aviv. And it seems as though she serves as a liaison between the New York and Tel Aviv offices. And there are countless other examples, both at SIPA and beyond, at Columbia, at other Ivies, at universities across the US. I think it's really important to note that these people are tasked with molding the minds of future policymakers, of future business people, of healthcare professionals. It impacts, kind of every sector of work. And these decisions and this knowledge kind of impacts what is done on Palestine, especially with advocacy. For healthcare workers, for example, or what policy decisions are made concerning Palestine and concerning this genocide or future genocides. And there's a massive impact, basically. And so when we talk about professor involvement in projects like GHF, or about the broader role of faculty in maintaining violent systems, I don't think this is incidental. It's part of how the university signals what kind of knowledge or power and violence it's aligned with. Beyond, the hiring decisions of the school, Columbia has shown that it has ceased being a place of academic learning and discourse, and it operates as a private business with private interests. Last year during the encampments, one of Columbia's largest donors, Robert Kraft, who is the CEO of the New England Patriots, pulled funding from the school because he claimed the school was letting anti-Semitism foster on campus. And Columbia expressed that it was grateful to Kraft after he pulled funding. Now with the Trump admin in place, we see the continued capitulation to their demands. And I don't think that this is occurring because the board and university admin are being pressured, but it's because these policies align with their political and financial agendas. And, as a recent alum that has had friends and peers kidnapped by ICE and DHS without even so much as a statement of condemnation or a statement of support for those people being made by the school, who has been at town halls where trustees waved away student concerns about safety and the university's complicit in this genocide by reminding us that they fund our scholarships, who has been arrested by the NYPD on campus at the behest of the university president. I can tell you firsthand that fostering a robust academic environment is not a priority of these institutions. And ultimately, institutions like Columbia they're not just bystanders, but they're co-architects of the very violence that students are protesting and being perpetuated in Palestine and in Gaza.
And Alex, if I could stick with you kind of on a related point, could you just, I think, expand a little bit more on just the broader implications of having these humanitarian aid initiatives administered through private contractors, period? I mean, I saw one report that was saying that the GHF wasn't providing water to hungry and thirsty Palestinians who show up at their aid sites just because it's too heavy and costs too much to bring into those sites. So can you walk us through, I guess, the thought processes behind this and the impact that this has on aid, this privatization of aid administration, how that is going to impact the humanitarian situation on the ground?
Sure. So, as we've discussed, these contractors are not humanitarian by design. They're private entities with private interests, and they operate as such. When we talk about the humanitarian field and aid, the system is already incredibly flawed. Humanitarian and development aid are not driven often by like purely altruistic motives. Instead, countries like the US, routinely leverage aid as a tool to advance foreign policy objectives and to secure compliance with their strategic interests. Aid can also prolong crises and entrench injustice, as it did in Gaza long before October 7th, by creating kind of a false sense of normalcy around a deeply abnormal and violent situation. Let's be clear, the blockade, the policy of mowing the grass, Israel's total control over Gaza's borders has never aligned with international human rights laws. But the humanitarian framework applied to Gaza and to Palestine has helped sustain the status quo for decades. It has created conditions in which Israel acts with impunity and in which Palestinians are so thoroughly dehumanized that the atrocities we have been witness to, not just over the past 2 years, but over the past more than 76 years, are not just tolerated, but normalized. And I do have to say, though, that despite the many flaws that are inherent within the system, there also exist many people who have good intentions, who, even if they're not fully bought into the system itself or the political goals behind it, are genuinely trying to help people however they can within the limits that they're given. The same cannot be said of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or this so-called distribution plan. This plan was concocted by business people and politicians with similar political and financial agendas in order to ethnically cleanse Gaza by forcing Palestinians into smaller and smaller concentration camps and to further financial gains in a genocide that is becoming increasingly difficult to justify and continue. And their actions reflect this. Every meal is counted. I think I saw a report somewhere where it stated that the total cost of each meal is $1.30. I'm not sure of the status of that now, but I mean, even if we look at that, these costs are way above what UNRWA, what WFP, what other organizations operating in Gaza were spending. And so kind of where is that money going and why are those costs so high? Like you said, it's too costly for these companies to bring in water aid. So they're not handing out bottled or clean water, but they're distributing food that can't be prepared without water. In a situation where there's no clean water because Israel has destroyed nearly all of Gaza's wash facilities. And you kind of have to ask, where is the humanitarian motive in that? Like was mentioned earlier, there were over 400 distribution sites before Israel's genocide, and now there are 4, and there are none in the north. And the GHF claims that they lack funding to open further sites. But what is even their purpose if the aid distribution apparatus was so effective that it kept Gaza going for 17 years of blockade, and that has been completely dismantled now in favor of this current plan. And I think that within this, we find our answer. This is what happens when disaster response is handled by private actors. Accountability disappears, humanitarian tenets are discarded, and the logic of markets replace the logic of care. The aid system that sustained Gaza, is being replaced by a PR operation for ethnic cleansing. And I would say that is the broader implication.
Can I interrupt briefly, Tariq?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, it puts us in a weird position where we're having to defend the humanitarian system that existed before. If you just go to Al-Shabaka, there's a host of research by Palestinians and allies criticizing the humanitarian system as it existed in Gaza, the West Bank, and even in the UNRWA camps for decades. And to have a situation where we are defending that system when really the violence is that Palestinians are so dependent on aid to begin with. We're sitting here arguing about who is the best responder to Palestinian humanitarian needs. Well, and the real answer is sovereignty, justice, and giving them control of their own borders and their own movement. If you don't want to have a bunch of debates about what the best aid is for Gaza and the West Bank, just get out of the way and stop making it impossible to be food sovereign, to import medicines, to depend on Israel to turn on and off the controls for electricity and water. That is the root cause here. So yes, the UNRWA and the UN and all these other agencies, they were able to fill some gaps. We've never been in a great place in terms of quality of life in the West Bank, and certainly not in Gaza. So to replace that broken and fundamentally flawed system with not even something humanitarian. This is security contractors that aren't even from the region, know nothing about it, probably on purpose, and are just told basically shoot any stragglers. It's a very strange place for us now to be in. And ultimately, the solution is not just the dismantling of the GHF, but to an end to the conditions that create such dependence in Palestinians to begin with.
And I think this really ties into what we were saying earlier, right? In terms of that the GHF quote unquote aid plan is not an aid plan. It's a mechanism of control. And with that in mind, Yada, could you just briefly describe how you see the GHF scheme as fitting into Israel's long-term strategy in Gaza, and how it is being used as a mechanism of ethnic cleansing and genocide?
Certainly. And, lucky for me, you don't even have to take my word for it. You just listen to the politicians and policymakers in Israel who are telling you that this is exactly what they want to do. And for some reason, we can't even believe them when they say that this is what they're going to do. Israel has made no there's no question of what the broader goals are for both the West Bank. And I know we're talking a lot about Gaza here, but to look at the complete picture of ethnic cleansing and territorial expansion, you really have to look at what's happening in both territories right now. Now, the Gaza Strip has always been seen as somehow different than the West Bank because as much as the blockade prevented movement in and out, there was relatively free movement within Gaza. You could go from Gaza City to Rafah. You could, you know what I'm saying? You could move within the territory. We are now at a situation where I think something like 90% of Gaza's land is considered militarized zone. So according to the Israelis, if you are there, you can be killed because you will be seen as a combatant immediately if you are in a place you're not supposed to be. We've seen from the beginning, from I think as early as December 2024, when there was that huge push to get people out of the north. And we started seeing these maps floating of buffer zones and security zones to get people from Gaza out. And at the same time, we were seeing Israeli politicians saying they'll never return. We were seeing conferences of settlers who were saying, hey, let's get the blueprints together. Let's build on this land. This is our land anyway. Thankfully, now we have the means to get them out. And so from the beginning, there has been a sustained effort to push Gazans south. Okay, so they got them south. They got them to Rafah. Then they destroyed Rafah. They closed that border. They bombed most of Rafah. They pushed them to the west coast. Now they are in this very tiny territory. They're not permitted to leave through Egypt. They're not permitted to go back to their homes in the north. And we also know that even in these quote unquote non-militarized zones or humanitarian zones, as Israel calls them, Israel bombs these zones and they bomb the evacuation routes that they tell civilians to go. So the problem, according to these entities, is that the previous distribution zones for aid were all throughout Gaza because where people were, they needed aid. And so aid convoys frequently had to coordinate with Israel to be able to go up north or travel through Israeli checkpoints. And many, many times these convoys were shot at or bombed or delayed or blocked or otherwise. So now you have 4 sites, all of which are in the south. So if you're in the north, even the small amount of aid that's getting in, you cannot get. What better motivator when you're starving, your children are starving, your family is starving, to get you, if you were able to stay in your home till this point, which I still know people that are in the north, what better way to get you to move than to promise you food when you're hungry? That's what's happening. They're saying if you want food, you cannot stay in the north. You must come to one of our sites. And people have, even people who held on for all this time, have started doing that just because of the desperation. That's not an accident. That's not an accident. The politicians are telling us we want them to leave the land so we can seize it. Suddenly, there's this Israeli backed scheme to distribute aid only in the parts of Gaza where they say where they don't, where they want people from Gaza to leave the north. It's not a coincidence. At the same time, we've seen the largest displacement in the West Bank since 1967. We've seen massive land seizures. Settlers are running rampant, seizing people's homes, destroying their property, destroying their agriculture. Again, nothing new, but to a point today where if this wasn't happening in Gaza, the West Bank would be the main story. This is all tied together. Now, one thing Israel has been very successful at is using every tool at its disposal to pressure Palestinian movement, to pressure Palestinian displacement. Gaza has given them the opportunity to do exactly that. And this whole premise of, well, things are so bad in Gaza now that if we allow them to voluntarily migrate elsewhere, voluntarily migrate, that is the humanitarian thing to do. And we already saw that people who were evacuated for medical cases, in some cases, were forced to sign paperwork that they would not be allowed to return to Gaza. Why is that? Why in the refugee camps in the West Bank, after they forced all the populations to go, they destroyed the homes, they took bulldozers through the streets to destroy the streets so that cars could not drive on them? Can we not pretend that this is about anything but displacing Palestinians? And can we finally listen to the Israeli government, which is telling us that that's what they want to do? And they're simply using every tool that they're allowed to use to do that. And the only problem is that everyone is watching, everyone knows what's happening, and they're still permitting this to happen. So I don't think the secret is a reason. The reason is a secret as to why the GHF has been set up this way. It's part of this broader settler colonial project. The question is why the rest of the world, even people who do know better, not who should know better, but who do know that Israel's goals are territorial expansion, to intervene in any possible way and continue to accept this facade that there's anything humanitarian about any of this.
And as you said, I mean, it's you don't have to believe us. It's them who are. It's their words. They're saying it plainly and explicitly that their intention is genocide and their intention is ethnic cleansing.
Their ministers attended a conference called "Preparing to Settle Gaza." I didn't make that up. That's them.
It's their words. So we have about 6-7 minutes left, but I do want to spend some. I want to get to some of the audience questions here, but I also want to weave in this last question I have about. We recognize that humanitarian aid isn't an endpoint or a solution, and we recognize this long before the GHF was invented, right? But there's a current need to provide support to Palestinians in Gaza right now to save lives, simply. So my question is, how can we do that from where we are? And what can the people who, for example, are on this call do to support people right now in light of the urgency of the situation? And maybe we can, I'd love to hear from both of you, and then we can try to answer some of these questions from the audience. Alex, do you want to start us off, and then you ought to follow up?
Sure. I mean, I think that, it's been nearly 2 years of this genocide. It's clear that politicians do not care about the will of the people or what's right or wrong. And I think at this point, we kind of need to speak their language and involve ourselves in direct action to make it financially costly for them to engage in these activities. That is clearly kind of the only thing that will make a dent in this. Is direct action, I think.
Yeah, this is a tough question because ultimately, like so many societal ails, this is not something that individuals can solve. Although I do recognize that individuals with conscience watching this feel like they have to intervene in some way. And I really respect that. So I think if you want to support people on the ground, there are sites like the Samir Project and Gaza Funds where you can donate directly to specific families to help them buy food that is in markets. So yes, they're incredibly inflated prices, but if people donate, then people can get food. There's no shortage of individual fundraisers on social media. Obviously, I can't vouch for them all, but do a little research and find trustworthy individual mutual aid sites. Um, on the ground is quite difficult because much of the humanitarian response is shut down. So normally I would say you can donate to UNRWA. You still can. They're still providing services in their other territories. But all of the primary stakeholders at this period are sitting at the border, waiting with the money, with trucks holding the pallets of food that so many good-hearted people paid for. There are organizations that people can donate to that are paying for medical evacuations, especially for children from Gaza, children who have amputations and require advanced surgery. There's PCRF, many of your audience may have heard of, or Heal Palestine. Now, all of these, again, they just help individual cases. They do nothing about the broader questions. I think look into those organizations, but really at this point, what is needed is all of us to use whatever levers of power are available to us, whatever your role, your status, your community, to pressure broader change in your state or your government's treatment of the Israeli government. I have thought this many, many times in my life, and I've learned not to get my hopes up, but I do feel that there is some sort of discourse shift that is happening, and permission structures are opening for people to be more vocal, people who might have been scared before. So we need to be part of the movement we already know polling shows that most people in most countries do not like what is happening and do not support it, including in the United States. So how do we leverage that power? And I think everyone needs to be creative. The reality is nothing has worked, so we don't know what works. So all of us need to do everything. So while we provide aid for people on the ground, we need to, again, push every button that we can that will put a broader stop to what's happening and ensure that accountability follows. We're past just needing a ceasefire at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously the narrative is shifting, but as we've seen, it's had little to no impact as of yet on actual policy making. But I mean, the time calls for, more than just awareness raising in that sense. It's political, like Alex said, political action, disruptive action, local community organizing, calling your representatives, pressuring your representatives in any way that you can. We have a bunch of questions in the chat, and most of them are pretty similar, kind of focused on getting some more detailed information and a list of companies, contractors, individuals, and organizations that should be boycotted. Alex, I mean, you've been in this research for a long time, and I'm sure you have a list. I don't expect you to be reading your list of companies out, but do you know if there's any, like, if you could direct people to any resource, any recent research that you've found kind of delves into this? It's obviously it's looking at the BDS list. It's looking at different reports that have been released recently. Could you speak to a little bit, about some of these U.S. based contractors that are involved, or kind of direct us to either your research or other research that exists that spells them out a little bit more explicitly?
Yeah, I think it's a bit difficult because these networks are so extensive. I'm not sure if there's like a central place where they're all listed. I'm hoping to publish something soon that will be available for people. Yeah, I think that there's the Financial Times has actually done some like pretty good reporting on these networks. It's really all dispersed, and that's a kind of the bulk of what my research has been is to bring all of these different threads together. So hopefully I'll have something in the next few weeks where people can look into it, and maybe create campaigns based off of this work, or even just participate in boycotting certain companies. Yeah, I think that's
yeah. I mean, it's again, it is still also early. I mean, the DHF has only existed in its current form for a couple of months now. So I think what everyone should do is pay attention to the reports that are coming out about it. And we've uncovered a lot already, and I think over the coming weeks we're just going to find out more about this really extensive web of involvement and complicity. But it looks like it's 11 o'clock here. We're all out of time. But I just want to thank Yara. I want to thank Alex for joining us today. Making this clear and painting a clearer picture for us about what's happening in Gaza. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, taking the time out of your day to learn about this. And then before we do sign off, I do want to remind everyone that these policy labs are a crowdfunded effort of Al-Shabaka. So we would be super thankful for any contributions that you could make to ensure that these events can continue happening. If you are able to donate, there should be a little donate sign that should appear on your screen somewhere. And any contribution we'd be very grateful for. Thanks again, everyone, and keep an eye on Alex's and Yara's research, because more will be coming out on this topic.
Thank you, Tariq. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thank you both.